Okay guys, in this particular lesson what we're going to cover is cellular diseases, and we're specifically going to talk about diseases that are related to the information in this chapter. So the first thing that we need to focus on is the idea that cellular disease is really about impaired physiology, and we should really remember the idea that physiology, when we're talking about that, what we're really talking about is the study of function. So what we're really going to focus on here is cellular functioning and specific processes within those cells. And we should all know that diseases ultimately occur at the cellular level, hence the impaired cellular functioning. If we think about our levels of organization, we can think about the idea that if there's a disease for the body, then it can be broken down to being located in a specific system. And from there, it can be broken down into perhaps one particular organ or maybe multiple organs. It can be broken down into specific tissue types and ultimately into specific cells. Sometimes it can even be broken down to the extent of what particular molecules or macromolecules within the cell are malfunctioning. Additionally, many of our cellular diseases are linked to genetics, and that should really kind of make sense since DNA is really what's going to control all of the cellular functioning. So if there's a genetic mistake, a mistake in the DNA, the performance of the cell and its functioning and processes are going to be impaired. So really some of the questions that we want to consider during this particular lesson are why cells are going to malfunction, why do cells age, how can we prevent diseases, how can we treat or cure diseases. These are all things that are relevant because once we recognize that the problem is at a cellular level, it gives us a lot more information to work with and a lot more knowledge to be able to build upon. So some of our specific organelle impairments, identifying particular organelles within the cell that cause disease. Tay-Sachs disease, which I know you guys have heard me talk about before. Tay-Sachs disease is a specific cellular disease, and the particular organelle that is malfunctioning in this case is the lysosomes. And we should all know that lysosomes contain digestive enzymes, right? They're those small little sacs that are going to break down organic molecules, and occasionally they're going to break down cellular structures as well. So if that lysosome or multiple lysosomes are malfunctioning, there's going to be a buildup of whatever it's supposed to break down. In this case, it's a fat buildup, and specifically in the nerve cells. Oftentimes it's fat buildup in the brain, central nervous system, and it causes severe impairment. MELAS, M-E-L-A-S, is going to be another disorder, mitochondrial encephalomyopathy, lactic acidosis, stroke-like episodes, kind of a mouthful there. In MELAS, what's actually happening is that you have a mitochondrial malfunction. And we should know that the mitochondria are responsible for cellular respiration, which is ultimately how we're making ATP, how we're making our energy. So if the mitochondria aren't doing that job properly, that means that the body is not receiving proper energy in order to do its particular functions. In this case, what actually happens is that there is going to be a lactic acid, hence the lactic acidosis, right? What we have here, there's a lactic acid buildup, and perhaps something is kind of ringing a bell about anaerobic cellular respiration for you guys. We'll talk a bit more about this in the next chapter, but from biology, we talked about aerobic and anaerobic cellular respiration. Lactic acid is a waste product of anaerobic cellular respiration, and when the mitochondria isn't functioning properly, it's not able to properly dispose of the lactic acid that builds up, and therefore it is kind of stuck. In addition, encephalomyopathy, is basically implying that there's going to be brain functioning impairment. Myopathy, we're talking about there being muscle impairment. We should be familiar with the idea of strokes. So there's quite a few different characteristics of this particular disorder. The other interesting thing is that the impairment is actually due to mitochondrial DNA, that small amount of DNA that can be found in the mitochondria. And mitochondrial DNA is actually passed from mother to child. The father has absolutely no part in the passing of that particular portion of genetic information. And since it goes from mother to child, the disorder is often shared between mother and child. So a mother that has MELAS is most likely going to have children with MELAS because her mitochondrial DNA is going to be passed on to her children, and therefore their mitochondrial DNA will be affected. So these are two examples of organelle disorders or organelle diseases due to malfunctioning structures within the cell. Another one, ALD, adrenoleukodystrophy. If we look, adrenoleukodystrophy. This is also going to be fat buildup, or in this case fatty acid buildup in the brain and spinal cord. Since that fat builds up, the nerve cells can't conduct their signal properly, and it gets slowed and impaired, and therefore the messages are not traveling properly. In this case, the peroxisomes are the particular organelle that is not functioning properly, and peroxisomes, like lysosomes, contain enzymes to break things down, and in this case the peroxisomes are missing one really important enzyme. Really interesting thing is that a movie, Lorenzo's Oil, is actually based on ALD, and it's actually based on a true story about a family that was affected strongly by adrenoleukodystrophy. If you have any interest in this, guys, it's actually a pretty good movie for you to check out. Then we have examples of cellular transport. So in this particular chapter, we talked about cells and specific structures within cells. Then we talked about cellular transport, and we also talked about cell division. So now we're talking about cellular transport, the second area that we talked about in the chapter. Perhaps you guys remembered last year when we talked about there being osmosis impairments. And I don't know if you can even really consider it to be an impairment because it's actually due to proper functioning. But a problem that exists due to osmosis, you guys should remember hyponatremia from the marathon runner's problem. All right, that hyponatremia, the low blood salt levels, which was the result of sweating and losing water and salt, but then your drinking habits while you're exercising is extremely, if you're drinking only water, you're not replenishing the salt content, so you wind up with low blood salt levels because of osmosis. But again, like I said, that's not really a disease necessarily. It's more based on your habit of what you're drinking, and that's why we have sports drinks for high power performing athletes. Channelopathies are another type of cellular disease. This is really about the ion channel disorders. You guys should be pretty well versed in this after the project that you had to work on. So some examples: long QT syndrome, cystic fibrosis, impressive syndrome. Long QT syndrome. Long QT syndrome is actually about potassium ion channel impairment. There's an abnormal potassium ion channel in the heart and inner ears, and because of that particular ion channel impairment, it's often linked to heart arrhythmias and hearing impairments due to the locations of those particular channels, the specific cells that those channels are being targeted in. So it's not the potassium channels everywhere in the body, it's specific to them being affected in the heart and inner ear. While cystic fibrosis, just like long QT syndrome, the cells are specific to particular areas of the body, but cystic fibrosis is really about abnormal chloride channels, and because of those abnormal channels in the lungs, the airways, pancreas, and some other places, it actually winds up affecting the sodium channels. So they kind of go hand in hand. So sodium channels end up being affected, and because the chloride channels are affected and then the sodium channels are affected, you wind up with some thickening of mucus. There's some water retention issues, and therefore the mucus winds up being thickened on the outside of the cells, and that's one of the key characteristics of cystic fibrosis. While impressive syndrome is actually about the sodium and the potassium channels. And the sodium and potassium channels are actually affected in muscle cells. Impressive syndrome can happen in humans as well as being very common in horses. In impressive syndrome, when the sodium and potassium channels are affected in the muscle cells, the muscle cells don't properly function, so you wind up with weakness, you wind up with trembling, you can end up with paralysis, and it's a relatively, like I said, common thing for thoroughbred horses.